Hey everyone, so in my last video, which admittedly has been a while, I talked about how we should understand a lot of the history and the legends that are portrayed in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, not as being historical truths like we understand history that's being written today, but instead in the same way that we understand the histories that were being written down and the legends being spread during our own Middle Ages. And we sort of have to look at them with those legendary sort of non-historical lens. So today I wanted to expand upon that a little bit and start talking about how we might use a modern historical understanding of pseudo-history and proto-history to sort of flesh out some of the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. And this video is going to very much follow the same formula that I used in my previous video, which is to say I'm going to start by talking about things in the real world, and then towards the end of the video bring this into the A Song of Ice and Fire series. So if you're one of my viewers that comes from a more historical interest, and you aren't as familiar or aren't as interested in A Song of Ice and Fire, I still think you'll be able to get a lot from this video, at least in the earlier parts. So I want to start by defining these terms, pseudo-history and proto-history, because if you're not, a specialist in these sorts of fields, I imagine a lot of you might not be overly familiar with these terms, pseudo-history and proto-history. So I'm going to first define pseudo-history, and this is really sort of the topics that I brought up in my last video. These are sources generally from earlier societies that like to portray themselves as history, but for one reason or another, we recognize in our modern times that they aren't really valid historical sources. They might have extremely strong biases, basically be propaganda being used for some sort of political purpose, or else they're based more on traditional sort of legendary histories, more than, again, the sort of factual scientific approach to history that people in the modern day prefer. So examples of pseudo-history that I might use to sort of flesh this out and give you a better picture is something like Romulus and Remus and the founding legend of Rome. On one hand, it'd be not the best to discount these if we're talking about Roman history. This is definitely something the Romans took very seriously, the founding of Rome by Romulus and his conflict with his brother Remus. But at the same time, while we can't fully discount it, it's important to bring in Romulus and Remus in any Roman history course. We shouldn't take it literally. We can look back using archaeology and, recognize that the founding of Rome wasn't really these two brothers who are descended from ancient Trojans that come into an abandoned hill. There's a much deeper history to that. So that would be a good example of pseudo-history, something that is theoretically historical but doesn't actually line up with our sort of modern scientific view of history and trying to find, the actual truth. Another good example would be something like the Iliad, or other stories about the Trojan War, where, we can say that, yes, there was, a Trojan War. And yes, we can even point to now on maps, where the city of Troy was. But there probably wasn't a Trojan horse. There probably wasn't, the literal gods coming down and influencing duels between Greek and Trojan heroes. It'd be sort of misguided to take the Iliad and treat it as a strictly historical text. But there's enough truth there that if you take the proper caution, you can use it to actually understand some proper ancient history around ancient Greece and ancient Troy. So that's pseudo-history. So what is proto-history? Proto-history we might understand as being a stage in historical development between prehistory and history. So using our most basic definitions, history starts when we have a historical record, when people start writing down what happens. Where you can study a text to understand the past of a society. And then prehistory is essentially illiterate societies that aren't leaving us a written historical record, and instead we have to understand their past through subjects like archaeology and sort of abandoning a textual approach. So proto-history is something that stands in between these two extremes. So this might encompass, there's really three ways to think about it, and I'll go through each of them in turn. One of them is early texts that aren't quite history, but would influence our understanding of history. These are basically things where, again, you don't have a full history, but there's enough written down that we can understand a little bit of what's happening in the historical past. So for instance, Viking runestones, which appear, well before we get Scandinavian history books, but they still have, these sparse inscriptions that might say something like, so-and-so, son of so-and-so, erected this runestone in memory of his brother who died in a battle in England. So again, we can't construct a full historical narrative about this, but we also can't, discount the historical text that we do have. This is quite a clear historical reference to some event in history, in this case, a Scandinavian raid going on in England. Or we might also think of Ogham stones, which are, again, very sparse, often even sparser than runestones, inscriptions that we find originally in sort of late Iron Age, early medieval Ireland, and then from Irish expansion outside of Ireland into places like Wales and Scotland. And these, again, will have very sparse text, usually just a name and some very basic bibliographic details about the person. So, for instance, might be a runestone that just says Ronan the priest, which, again, we can't construct a historical narrative around an inscription that just says Ronan the priest, but we can use that to understand a little bit about the past going on in this society. So the fact that, an individual is identifying himself as a priest instead of as a druid, we can use this to recognize that there was a Christian society at the time. Or likewise, it might say, so-and-so is a member of this tribe. And we might recognize that tribe as being the ancestors to a particular kingdom. And we can sort of trace the prehistoric roots of an early medieval kingdom by recognizing particular Ogham stone inscriptions. So again, they're not really a historic society yet. We don't have written down histories, the Irish annals or anything, but we have enough inscriptions that we also can gain knowledge about their past from these historical records, and it would be selling them short to treat them strictly as a prehistoric society. Another example of something we might consider being a proto-history is outside historical sources. So, for instance, in Caesar's Gallic War, he talks about his expedition into Iron Age Britain. And Britain at the time isn't creating any historical records. So on one hand, we can't treat them as strictly a prehistoric society. It is a valid way to use, in this case, the Roman historical texts to understand Iron Age Britain at this period, but it's also important to recognize the British at the time aren't leaving their own historical records. And we need to treat things like Caesar's account of Iron Age Britain with appropriate caution. And then our final source for proto-history is the pseudo-history that I sort of started off by talking about. So again, if we look at something like the Iliad, it's not a valid historical source in some senses, in that we shouldn't take sources like the Iliad or other Greek myths about the Trojan War and treat them as historical fact. We shouldn't say that the events happened exactly as these texts are describing. But they can still tell us other broader generalities about the past that they represent. So, for instance, in the Iliad, people are using bronze weapons, their heroes are fighting in chariots, and there's no really sort of horse-mounted cavalry to speak of. You're either in a chariot or on foot. So these are very clearly referencing an earlier Bronze Age society that's distinct from the the period in time where we're getting down, the written text of the Iliad as they survive today. So again, we can use them if we have appropriate caution to inform us about this otherwise prehistoric period, but at the same time, they're not quite history as we would like to understand it. And in this case, using pseudo-histories is really going to be what we're leaning on in this discussion. But it's very interesting to point out that just a lot of what we think about of first man culture in A Song of Ice and Fire would really sit as proto-history rather than prehistory. We have first man ruins on a few monuments, such as at Oldstone, and we have pseudo-historical myths, of things like the Long Night. So it would be wrong to discount them as purely prehistoric, but as I mentioned in that earlier video, we can't really consider them a true historic society either. So from here, I'm going to start talking about our real-world history, and particularly using medieval proto-history or medieval pseudo-history to talk about a proto-historic period in medieval Ireland. And for this, I'm going to focus on a people group called the Corcaligta. So the Corcaligta were like I said, they were a people group. They were sort of a ruling, like a royal sept, that we're told in some myths they originally come from Scotland and migrate from Scotland into Northern Ireland, from Northern Ireland down to the southwest of Ireland, around the Dingle Peninsula, and then from Dingle they migrate eastwards, running into around the area of Cashel, and ultimately into Ossory, so around Kilkenny today. And in this in that final migration, moving from Dingle towards Kilkenny, we hear about them fighting against another people group called the Owenachta. The Owenachta are the group that sit around Cashel, and they would be, for most of the early medieval period, really until the reign of Brian Boru. The Owenachta are the primary kings of medieval Munster, sitting at the Rock of Cashel and ruling over this large provincial overkingdom. So we read in a few pseudo-historical sources about the Corcaligta fighting against the Owenachta in an alliance with another people group called the Osriga. These are the namesakes of modern Ossory. And they're fighting a war that they ultimately lose against the Owenachta. And the Owenachta are able to push the border of Munster into its modern border between Tipperary and Kilkenny. However, not all of the pseudo-historical sources agree with this. So there's also some that still portray generally the same story. We have the Corcaligta as an outside group. They're migrating sort of eastwards, and they encounter the Owenachta, and they enter this conflict between the Owenachta and the Osriga. However, in some of these stories, the Corcaligta are actually on the other side of the conflict. Rather than being allied with Ossory against Munster, they're fighting with Munster and help Munster conquer Ossory. And from there, they sort of become overkings of Ossory, not through an internal alliance with Ossory, but as these conquering peoples aligned with Munster. And there's actually a few other interesting, historical problems if we're trying to take these medieval pseudo-histories. So, for instance, while I mentioned most sources agree that the Corcaligta are an outside source coming ultimately from Britain, but more recently from other parts of Ireland and entering Owenachta land, a lot of the genealogies of the Owenachta actually show the Corcaligta and the Owenachta as the same people group. That is to say that Conall Cork, who is the ancestor of the Corcaligta, and Owen the Great, the ancestor of the Owenachta, are actually related to each other. They should be the same people group if we're defining a people group, by genetic terms, by their literal descent. And this is most likely because these aren't reflecting historical realities. So, for instance, the Owenachta probably aren't actually a single line descended from this historical person, Owen the Great. It's possible that Owen the Great was a real person, and he did, found the dynasty that would become Cashel. But all of these other wider Oenocta sects, people like the Corcyligda, probably aren't actually descended from Owen the Great in the same way, but instead they're an outside people that are sort of brought into the fold and recognized as Oenocta for political reasons, to sort of cement an alliance between this. And there's even some, although less conclusive evidence, that the Corcyligda are doing the same thing, that the Corcyligda aren't actually a single unified entity from as far back as these pseudo-historical sources would like us to believe, but they were actually two different people groups that then merged together during sort of late prehistory to become the Corcyligda. And that could explain things like why we find the Corcyligda on both sides of the conflict between the Oenocta and the Ostroga. It's because these two separate people groups that would become the Corcyligda were actually on both sides. So you could say, theoretically, we have one group of Corcyligda that are sort of vaguely present in the south of Ireland already, that are on one side of the conflict, and one group of people who would become the Corcyligda who migrate into the area and are on the other side. So this is how we can use pseudo-history to inform our understanding of prehistoric and proto-historic time periods, not by taking these stories as literally true, but by recognizing these discrepancies between different versions of the story and trying to create a reasonable historical record that could explain all these differences by recognizing the untruths behind them as well as the truths, and what sort of political motivation people might have to create these stories. And we can see this in other stories as well. So sticking with Ireland, one of the most powerful groups in the north of Ireland are the O'Neills, who sort of dominated high kingship, including the kingship of Tara in the early medieval period. And they trace their ancestor back to a figure called Neil of the Nine Hostages, which according to some pseudo-historical texts was because he had 9 hostages that were kept sort of as sureties against people he had conquered from across Europe. So he had a hostage from the Romans, a hostage from the Franks, a hostage from the Anglo-Saxons, and so on. And most likely this isn't true, that there was some massive historical empire during the time of people like the Romans or, the Franks that goes unrecorded by everyone except the Irish. This just probably is more legend than true history. However, we also know from early texts, including a few pseudo-historical texts, that there was a specific group that were from earliest times seemed to be aligned or sort of conquered under the O'Neills. These are the people of Oriel. And a lot of these earlier texts define them not as a single people group of Oriel, but the 9 tribes. And this could be, again, a good way of combining our understanding of Neil of the 9 Hostages and these 9 tribes of the Oriel to create a situation where most likely Neil of the 9 Hostages was sort of the first high king to dominate northern politics, not by conquering everyone, but by having, his own O'Neill kingdom and by getting a hostage from each of these 9 tribes. We can also see this if we move away from Ireland. A historical person in a lot of Welsh genealogies of early Welsh kingdoms is Magnus Maximus, who was a Roman usurper. He establishes himself. He's, a Roman general who, while he was in Britain, becomes sort of elevated to emperor by his troops, and he starts a military campaign conquering a lot of the continent and being recognized as an emperor. And a lot of early medieval Welsh genealogies will put Magnus Maximus in some capacity in their royal line. And again, it's unlikely that if we're looking at true scientific understandings of history, that Magnus Maximus actually fathered all of these medieval Welsh genealogies. But instead, they're, for one reason or another, co-opting this important historical figure, Magnus Maximus, into their genealogies to give themselves more prestige and to say, we reflect, the continuation of Rome in this part of the world. And possibly this is, again, based on some historical truths. Magnus Maximus probably would have put local rulers in charge as his authority in Britain. So if we imagine these people that are claiming descent from Magnus Maximus are sort of turning Magnus Maximus from just somebody who puts them in power to a direct genealogical ancestor as a way to sort of co-opt more power, more authority, and more legitimacy, but still reflecting a possible historical truth between a relationship between Magnus Maximus and these historical people. So those are some of the ways I hopefully demonstrated well how we might use pseudo-history to inform our understanding of the past in a prehistoric or proto-historic society by using proper caution and taking a critical eye to the way that these pseudo-historical legends are being portrayed. So I want to then say, can we use this to understand some of the prehistoric and proto-historic sort of first man era of the past in the A Song of Ice and Fire stories? And I think we definitely can in some cases. And for my example for this, I want to use the figure of Garth the Green. Garth the Green, who also has a few other names that he goes by, Garth of the Green Hands, and so on, becomes a sort of revered as a god almost in some first man legends. And he's described as having many descendants. He's described, in divine terms as being fertile in bringing fertility of the land. He introduces farming, plants, trees, and flowers bloom in his presence, but also sort of human fertility, and that he has tons of descendants. He causes women to flower. Even barren women can become pregnant again in his presence, or sometimes through his presence in a more material mean. However, while some of these myths try to portray him as important, the first high king of all the first men and stuff like that, or again, elevating him to a divine or semi-divine status, even in the text, a lot of the maesters and other figures who are using a more scientific historical background think of him again as somebody who would have been a first high king of the first men, or a historical person that through retelling of legends and magnifying his importance becomes this, from a pseudo-historical personages to a legendary personages. But what's interesting is, with really two exceptions that I could find, all of his descendants, all of his importance is limited to the Reach. So all of the great houses of the Reach claim in some regard to be descended from Garth the Green. In particular, the House Gardener is descended from, I believe, his firstborn son, Garth the Gardener, the firstborn son of Garth the Green. And we know from other sources in the in-universe that House Gardener were the ancient kings of the Reach. And they sort of maintained power in the Reach until they were supplanted by the current powers in the Reach, House Tyrell. So I think we could use, again, if we take this historical or pseudo-historical person of Garth the Green as an eponymous ancestor to House Gardener and to a lot of the houses of the Reach, and his sort of elevated importance as someone who ruled over all of the first men. This could reflect something like the historical figures I mentioned in Irish pseudo-history or Welsh pseudo-history, people like Owen the Great, people like Niall of the Nine Hostages, people like Magnus Maximus, where you have a possible historical ancestor to the kings of the Reach, someone like, an ancestor of House Gardener. And then House Gardener establishes themselves as not just, local petty lords, but as kings of the Reach, as they sort of conquer or forge alliances or otherwise get the submission of other people in what we might consider this prehistoric or proto-historic ancestor to the Reach, that they become incorporated into these genealogies of Garth the Green to cement their alliances and create a unified kingdom out of these separate petty lords, in the same way that we might see something like the creation of the Oanakta as a theoretical, genealogically related people group was a way to cement alliances and create a kingdom of Munster outside of these disparate groups like the Corcaligta. So I think, again, using our understandings of prehistory and proto-history and pseudo-history, we can establish ourselves a interesting timeline or not necessarily timeline, but just an interesting historical backdrop to the creation of the Reach, using our understanding of real-life pseudo-historical figures and applying them to figures like Garth the Green. And earlier I mentioned two figures outside of the Reach that seem to have possible relation to Garth the Green. And these are Lann the Clever and Bran the Builder. So Lann the Clever is the eponymous ancestor of House Lannister. And according to legend, he takes over Casterly Rock, although legends tell different stories about how he takes over Casterly Rock from the Casterlys. And again, we have comments from maesters, from people taking a more scientific approach, that again try to separate this mythological figure of Lann the Clever being a sort of trickster god who relates and who tricks the Casterlys into abandoning their castle and then taking over, and they assert he's some figure like a Castellan who just happens to supplant or marry his way in, or in some way more realistically take over the area that would then become the Westerlands. And because Lann the Clever is, at least in some instances in the story, described as a descendant of Garth the Green, and even when the stories disagree exactly what happens, he's portrayed as an outsider who comes and takes over Casterly Rock from the Casterlys and establish himself as a power in the Westerlands. We can again use this as possibly reflecting some sort of true proto-historical event, where I would suggest, Lann the Clever is probably originally, some figure from the Reach, and that the story of House Lannister and taking over Casterly Rock is, again, not these legends we find of him sneaking a lion into Casterly Rock, or secretly impregnating somebody, or all of these other trickster myths, but instead reflecting an event in Westerosi Protohistory where the ancestors of House Lannister migrate from the Reach and conquer this small area of the Westerlands, and then over time sort of assimilate into Western culture, which is why their connection to the Reach becomes less important and less emphasized in later retellings of the myth, because the Lannisters are now setting them apart, trying to not be portrayed as outside invaders from the Reach, but instead as true Westermen and Westerwomen. So again, we can get a little bit more of a understanding of possible Westerosi proto-history by taking our pseudo-historical approaches into A Song of Ice and Fire. The other figure, Bran the Builder, I think complicates things a bit more, because again, you could try portraying the same thing, that the reason Bran the Builder is sometimes portrayed as a descendant of Garth the Green is, again, representing some sort of migration. But I don't believe this to be the case for a couple of main reasons. One is that unlike the stories of the Lannisters, where Lann the Clever is an outsider taking over Casterly Rock, the other legends we find about the Starks, they're always portrayed as being of the North. There's no legend of them, coming in an invading wave into the North and taking over Winterfell. Rather, they establish Winterfell. When they conquer the Neck and the Marsh Kings, they're not coming from the south and moving into the north, but rather they're already at Winterfell, waging war southwards to invade the marshlands. So I think more realistically, this could have I still think it's likely reflecting something we can use to understand proto-history, but being, again, a false genealogy made for political purposes. Because the Starks, as the conquerors of the Neck, have more access to Southron lords and Southron politics than other northern lords might, like, for instance, the Boltons and the Red Kings. I would have been cut off from accessing potential allies in the south by the Starks controlling the Neck. And we also find Stark legends, particularly of Bran the Builder, helping other Southron lords. So, for instance, Bran the Builder is sometimes described as helping found Storm's End in the Stormlands, or helping Oldtown, also of the Reach. So what I think is happening is, if we're going to take in these stories and treat them as real-world history, is not necessarily stories of the Starks coming from the Reach or coming from the Stormlands, but instead a way of melding these two people's mythologies to create a shared history for political purposes. Once the Starks control the Neck and are able to have stronger diplomatic relationships with the Proto-Reach and the Proto-Stormlands, that as a way to express these new diplomatic relationships, they want to create a shared mythical history in the same way that, again, we find shared mythical histories through people like Magnus Maximus, through people like Owen the Great, through people like Neil of the Nine Hostages. So I think that if we're taking these as being similar to the way we understand proto-history in the real world, it's a reflection of the Starks' unique position to create diplomatic relationships with Southron lords during the First Man era of prehistory. So in conclusion, I don't really think any of what I talked about is going to affect the story of A Song of Ice and Fire. I don't think that the Lannisters are going to try to claim the Reach because Lann the Clever has a descent through Garth the Green, so they're in theory descended from a legitimate power source in the Reach. Or same thing with the Starks trying to claim authority over the Stormlands or the Reach, or the Reach trying to assert authority in either of those directions. I just don't think, there's anything that's actually going to affect the narrative of the stories through this. But I still think it's fun to consider, and that even though we have characters like Sam and the Maesters talk about how we can't really know what happened because the First Men didn't leave any histories, that no, we can if you use a critical lens and approach with enough caution in the same way that we do our real-world prehistoric societies. We can, in fact, learn a little bit about the First Man histories in A Song of Ice and Fire. And just as somebody who, in their academic career, in real life, is taking these sorts of approaches to understanding the history of people like the Oanakta, I just found it really fascinating that I could apply that same knowledge to learn about this fictional history in A Song of Ice and Fire. So again, I don't think this is going to influence the story, but I just think it's really interesting and really fascinating to sort of consider these things as just an intellectual exercise. And then finally, just to close out, I want to do a little bit of self-promotion. I have a TikTok that I use and upload more regularly than my YouTube, just because it takes less effort to make TikToks than to make YouTube videos. I do have a few just sort of jokey, sort of comedy-esque skit videos, but most of my TikTok is just talking about history in short bite-sized bits, 3 minutes or less. So if you like the sort of content I produce here, and you'd be interested in some short-form historical content, I'll leave a link to my TikTok down in the description. And hopefully you'll like the content I've been posting there. So thank you for watching, and let me know what you think of my theories down in the comments.